today we got a crazy story about Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein. We got a crazy story, bro, about him and these allegations. They've been circulating everywhere. I've been seeing it everywhere, bro. TikTok, Facebook, whatever you want to call it. It's just like, I didn't believe it, though. I ain't gonna lie. I didn't believe it until them files dropped. So I said, I need to talk about this because this is some shit. So, bro, like, this is crazy stuff, bro. I done seen some names, like some big people names in them files, bro. And it's like, bro, just knowing this shit is just crazy. But I want y'all to like, comment, subscribe down below on this video. We're gonna keep dropping these every week, bro. We're gonna come back with something new all the fucking time. So stay tuned, bro. And we're gonna get right into it. Also, because this, I want to know more about this.
The most prestigious in Manhattan, a school for the children of the elites. The students were the children of highly paid bankers, developers, politicians, people that could afford to pay a tuition equal to $50,000 a year today. By the time he started teaching at Dalton, Epstein was almost a completely different person. Basically, as a teacher, Jeffrey Epstein was a sleazy scum.
Parents, if your child plays Roblox, listen up. You could qualify for up to $300,000 or
so that explains why
a bit of a disaster. In the mid-1970s, students at one of New York's most esteemed prep schools were surprised to encounter a new teacher who pushed the limits of the school's strict dress code, wandering the halls in a fur coat, gold chains, and an open shirt that exposed his chest. But it wasn't just a willingness to dress provocatively, it was how he interacted with students that left an impression on many of them for decades after. He was apparently popular among female students, as many young teachers might be, but the problem was that he not only embraced the attention, but also seemed to have chased after it. The story goes that at one point, he even started showing up at students' parties, including ones where they would have been drinking underage. But before this private school teacher in his mid-20s could ever get involved in something that might implicate him in a serious way, Epstein was fired from the Dalton school for performance issues. He simply wasn't a good teacher. But at the same time, though, he was able to move his career in a way that I could only describe as failing upwards. Because if you fast forward about 20 years, Epstein was no longer this sort of aimless college dropout who had a reputation for being a bit of a creep towards students at the school he worked at. It was almost as if Epstein would go on to become a completely, literally different person. When you look deeper at how exactly Epstein goes from this disgraced school teacher to flying a jetliner around the world while he rubs elbows with the rich and famous, the puzzle pieces don't really fit together. It would only be a few months after getting fired from the Dalton school in 1976 until Epstein found another job. Specifically, he got hired at the giant investment firm Bear Stearns as an assistant to a floor trader. And it's the second time he did that in just a couple of years. Because if he did do one thing right while working at Dalton, it was impress his students' rich and powerful parents.
Specifically, he was hired off the recommendation of a student's parent he had impressed who also happened to be friends with Alan Greenberg, CEO of the bajillion-dollar Bear Stearns investment bank. Greenberg was also known for coming from a working-class background, and he liked to hire people with what he called PSD degrees: poor, smart, and desperate to be rich. Whether or not getting his foot in the door was his original goal while working at a private school, whatever it was, Epstein had launched himself up the ladder in a massive way.
And it's kind of weird, but Epstein's time at this giant financial services firm, it wasn't all that different from his time as a teacher. Within just 4 years there, he gets promoted from junior assistant to limited partner, which is a pretty crazy trajectory for someone with no college degree. But then, just a year after that, he was actually asked to quit or be fired during an SEC investigation into insider trading at Bear Stearns. But for the rest of the 1980s, he would start or get involved in a strange series of businesses that, if we didn't know they existed, kind of sound made up.
Speaking of strange businesses, I wanted to let everyone know that the shirt I'm wearing in this video, I designed it and embroidered it myself, and it's on sale now. I think it's pretty obvious what the meaning is here, that our entire world is being sold out to evil people. So if you want to buy the most morbid and grim YouTube merch ever made, it is available. It's actually really high quality. The shirts are super solid, they're made with American cotton, and the embroidery is done on location at my studio, and there's free shipping inside the US. So you can check out spiritworld.store, help support the channel in a really big way, and cop a super nice shirt at the same time. That's spiritworld.store to buy the American Realty shirt, or the link is also below in the description.
Probably the strangest out of everything he did during this time was Towers Financial Corporation, a collection agency that was in the business of buying consumer medical debt. While he was hired as a consultant and paid the equivalent of $69,000 a month today, the first job he was given was to start using the company as a raiding vessel for corporate takeovers. In the 80s, there was this popular practice of buying a large stake in a corporation, then firing top executives, and then downsizing even further investor to increase the share value before selling. Basically, you take over and ruin a company just to make money from it. And their first move was to attempt a takeover of a kind of old, declining airline, Pan American World Airways, in 1987. A year later, they also tried to take over Emory Air Freight. And while both attempts failed, that wasn't the problem. The problem is that they were using money they didn't actually have. Basically, while this company was claiming to be a debt collection agency, they had also raised $500 million from investors while promising big returns. They used the money on private jets, fancy houses, expensive cars, and their plan for paying it all back was to attempt those crazy corporate takeovers that were supposed to make enough profit to cover everything. But then when the takeovers failed, they had nowhere to turn, no money to repay the investors, and it all fell apart. And so in 1993, Towers Financial would implode after being exposed as one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in American history. But when it came time for his former business partner, Stephen Offenberg, to be deposed and tell his side of the story in court, he didn't just throw Epstein under the bus, he basically blamed the whole thing on him. But by the time the company collapsed and was being investigated, Epstein had already been gone for 3 years. He would never be charged with anything related to Towers Financial. Meanwhile, his business partner Offenberg, he would spend nearly 20 years in prison. I don't think we have an exact reason why Epstein was never charged for being on the inside of one of the biggest Ponzi schemes ever. One explanation is that Offenberg could have been lying. His testimony during his case was considered kind of generally unreliable. He would lie about a lot of stuff, wouldn't tell the truth. Another reason is that if Epstein was never really on the record as being deeply involved in the fraud, because apparently they didn't use his name for the trades or whatever it was, it's just hearsay. You know, we can't really prove that he's involved in the scam, so it's not worth pursuing if they did have Offenberg right in front of them and they could just punish him. However, another person would later write that it was only because of lazy prosecution that Epstein walked away and that he was definitely involved as far as anyone can tell. Especially because it's well recorded that during the peak of the Towers Financial scam, Epstein was physically accompanying Offenberg around the world on his jet. He was meeting with investors. He was with him a lot of the time. And that's because somehow, after walking away from a moderately high-paying consultant job and apparently having nothing to do with the hundreds of millions of dirty money it made, he somehow pops up again a couple years later, completely reinvented, like his old self never existed at all. But the idea that Epstein's career is just kind of a story about failing upwards, like I mentioned earlier, that doesn't even really explain how he ends up where he did. Yeah, a teacher at a rich private school might get hired by one of the students' rich parents, okay? But 15 years later, walking away unscathed from one of the worst financial crimes in American history, I mean, seriously, most of us probably don't remember, but Towers Financial was absolutely horrible. Even back at that point in his life, a lot of his situations sound like a conspiracy. But of course, that's only one of these really odd stories that have been told about Epstein's careers over the years that imply all these different truths about how he ended up where he did. Multiple people over the years, journalists, friends, business partners, they all recalled Epstein suggesting or hinting that he worked for an intelligence agency, although he never specified which one. But in the mid to late 80s, during the same time he was working at Towers Financial, he also worked with Adnan Khashoggi, the Saudi businessman with ties to the CIA and Mossad, who is best known for being the middleman in transferring American weapons from Israel to Iran during the Iran-Contra affair. Add on to that the fact that Epstein was later found to have a fake Austrian passport with multiple stamps from the Middle East, it only further paints a very confusing picture about Epstein's career. There just isn't a normal, sensible conclusion to this part of Epstein's life. Even after connecting all the dots, it still doesn't make sense. He starts off by dropping out of college without getting his degree, only to get hired at a prestigious school that he then gets fired from for being a bad teacher, only to then get hired at a hugely prestigious investment firm that he also then gets fired from, only to then end up getting implicated in one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in American history that he somehow never faces a single charge for being involved in. Along the way, he acquires fake passports, he does business with arms dealers in the Middle East, and at the end of all of it, he's filthy rich. At every single turn, you see him get not punished, but actually rewarded for stealing, cheating, and lying. But the craziest part of all of that is that that was just the beginning. In the late 80s, Epstein forms a new company, Epstein & Co., a wealth management firm that he establishes immediately, but he's not going to take any clients with a net worth of under $1 billion. And his first client would indeed be a prolific billionaire, although the relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Les Wexner would only create more questions than it answers. Les Wexner wasn't just rich, he was one of the most successful retailers in modern American history.
After opening his own clothing store in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio in 1963, he grew his brand The Limited to 100 stores within 12 years. By the mid-1980s, he was purchasing other brands, one of which was the failing Victoria's Secret for $1 million. But within 10 years, by 1992, he grew it to a value of $1 billion. Over the years, he continued to buy and start more brands. Abercrombie & Fitch, Lane Bryant, Bath & Body Works, the White Barn Candle Company. Basically, if you've ever stepped into a mall in North America, you've seen Les Wexner's businesses. His brands still fill suburban shopping centers today. But Leslie Wexner was also a very strange person. In 1985, the year that he became a billionaire for the first time, he began building up his personal brand with interviews about his businesses, his life, but the man that the world was introduced to as the owner of Victoria's Secret and Abercrombie & Fitch, he seemed to sit somewhere in the gray area between spiritual warrior and mentally ill. On the morning Leslie Wexner became a billionaire, he woke up worried, but this was not unusual. He always wakes up worried because of his D-book, which pokes and prods and gives him the itchiness of the soul that he calls hins in Yiddish. Sometimes he runs away from it on the roads of Columbus, Ohio, or drives away from it in one of his Porsches, or flies from it in one of his planes. But then later it comes back, with his first coffee, his first meeting, nudging at him again. A D-book is essentially translated from Yiddish as a demon. As the article continues, it states that Wexner has been with the D-book since he was a boy, and that his father recognized it and referred to it as churning. He told New York Magazine that his D-book makes him wander from house to house, wanting more and more, and swallowing companies larger than his own. In other words, it compels him to accumulate more money and more power with no end in sight. Wexner also describes the D-book as an integral part of his genius. Throughout his career, he had a habit of cutting people off abruptly, even longtime friends and business partners. People would call him impossible to know. One person who interviewed him early in his life said that he acted as if he had met the devil. At one point, he bought every property near his mansion in Ohio so no one could be near him. He even built a massive estate modeled after an English manner, complete with secret passageways and interior surveillance, as well as walls outside. People would say that it didn't even seem like he enjoyed being wealthy. He just craved control of everything around him. He would micromanage every detail of the stores he owned, from the layouts to the fabric he used to the clothes. And this is the man who would be the first big client of Epstein's private elite money management firm. Starting in the late 80s, Leslie Wexner handed Jeffrey Epstein practically complete control over his personal fortune.
Personal fortune? Like your own money? Oh, that's crazy. You give me control of your bank account, boy, it's never gonna come back to you.
If you wanted to be funny, you could say that Epstein himself was Leslie Wexner's D-book. But in reality, the dynamic that Epstein had with Wexner makes him almost look like a parasite. Virtually from the moment that Epstein arrived on the scene in Columbus, Ohio, where Wexner's brands were based, Mr. Wexner's friends and colleagues were mystified as to why a renowned businessman in the prime of his career would place such trust in an outsider with a thin resume and scant financial experience. And it was around the time that Epstein launched Epstein & Co., his investment services company, that his life kind of just seems to completely change all over again for what feels like the 100th time in a row. By the early 90s, he's moving like someone who's in charge of an empire. He's flying around the world in a giant jetliner, he's acquiring massive properties around the US, but at the same time, his name never shows up in Forbes. He has no public filings, no client list, no office, but to the people around him, it looks like he owns the world. By the late 90s, Epstein's doing what I could only describe as flying too close to the sun. He's friends with Donald Trump, the Prince of England, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He even buys a literal island where he would build an extravagant compound for hosting parties. But after a series of conspicuous stunts, one of which was a trip to Africa on his private plane with Bill Clinton, Kevin Spacey as passengers, it gets to a point where Epstein is too big to ignore. The media, the general public, people are wondering how Epstein made all this money, where he came from, what's the point of everything he does. How we got to this level of social status is yet another strange story in this never-ending list of strange stories. And a big part of it would be this very, very strange story of his connection to the Maxwell family media empire. Robert Maxwell was born Ian Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hawk. He was a media tycoon businessman with a really strange life. After growing up Jewish in a small town in Romania, almost his entire family was tragically killed at Auschwitz. But he ends up joining the army in France after escaping, and he gets a bunch of medals for storming a Nazi machine gun tower and surviving. After the war, he changes his name to Robert Maxwell, moves to England, and gets elected into the British Parliament. But he also quickly starts building a media empire across Europe at the same time. Over a period of around 50 years, he ends up owning the Daily Mirror. He owns part of MTV in Europe, the London Daily News. At one point, he even buys the US-based Macmillan Publishers for over $2 billion in the late 80s. But throughout his life, he was also closely linked to Israeli intelligence. Robert Maxwell allegedly helped Israeli spies distribute bugged surveillance software to two of the most important nuclear research and security facilities in the US. At the same time, the United Kingdom would call him most likely a double or triple agent financed by Russia. He had known links to MI6, KGB, and Mossad all at the same time. Anyway, in the early 90s, Robert Maxwell is deeply in debt, his companies are struggling, and just a few days before he was scheduled to default on a $50 million loan, he apparently fell off the side of his yacht and drowned in the Canary Islands. Shortly after that, news comes out that he had been stealing hundreds of millions of dollars out of the pension funds from all the companies he owned to keep his lifestyle afloat, and his already tarnished legacy was ruined forever. But of course, that's not before he was given a lavish state funeral in Israel, attended by the Prime Minister and President and all current and former heads of Israeli intelligence. The point being, though, is that one of Robert Maxwell's 9 children, Ghislaine, had long been a prominent socialite in London and New York, and after her father died and the family empire collapses in the early 90s, she ends up living in Manhattan, where she would end up dating none other than Jeffrey Epstein. Notably, Ghislaine, the daughter of this internationally known billionaire spy for Israel, would become the primary link between Epstein and his powerful social network. Out of many things she would do for him, she would be the person who introduces him to Prince Andrew, Saudi royals, celebrities, politicians. Of course, Epstein was already pretty well connected, but his relationship with Maxwell was pivotal in him inserting himself into the upper echelon of society.
In March of 2003, Vanity Fair journalist Vicky Ward sets out to write a profile about Jeffrey Epstein and figure out what exactly he's all about once and for all. Lately, Jeffrey Epstein's high-flying style has been drawing oohs and ahs. The bachelor financier lives in New York's largest private residence, claims to only take billionaires as clients, and flies celebrities like Bill Clinton and Kevin Spacey on his Boeing 727. But Pierce's air of mystery and the picture changes.
And her point was that after peeling back his mask of mystery, something far more alarming than anticipated would be revealed. Her research led her to question the idea that Epstein made all of his money with an exclusive and private investment firm where he'd only take on billionaires as clients. She suggests that Leslie Wexner is the only client Epstein ever had, but even more than that, that his business isn't really how he made his money at all. What she found made it look like Epstein really wasn't a genius investor at all, but probably acquired the majority of his mysterious fortune from the Tower's financial Ponzi scheme, which he was far more involved in than the official story would suggest. She essentially made him look like a fraud, a con man with no substantial investing history, hiding behind the persona of an elite financial mastermind while building up a social network to make him look a lot more sophisticated than he really was. Even worse than what they did publish about him is what they didn't. While she was working on her profile of Epstein for Vanity Fair, Vicky Ward was approached by 2 sisters who claimed that Epstein had sexually assaulted them in the mid-90s. One of them would have been under 18 at the time. They had even notified authorities, although no action was taken by the NYPD. Allegedly, Epstein had promised the younger sister that he could get her access to programs that would earn her admission to Ivy League schools she desperately wanted to get into. For the older sister, he offered financial support for her art career. Once he had them alone, they were both assaulted. Originally, their accusations were written into his profile in Vanity Fair, but while Vicky Ward and her team were working on the story, Epstein started showing up at their office and asking him not to include any mentions of the young women. Not only does Epstein show up at their office, but in that same week, a bullet and the head of a dead cat were placed on the front steps of Vanity Fair's editor-in-chief's home. After that, no mentions of these accusations were included in the final article. Vicky Ward would later write that she was so afraid of Epstein that she hired security to watch over her babies in the NICU when she gave birth prematurely a few months later. But I think ultimately these profile pieces of Epstein that painted him as this mysterious, maybe a little shady, maybe a little bit of a con artist, quirky, whatever, I think in a way it inadvertently helped him in the end. Even though they were casting shadows of doubt over his honesty and his business ethics, whatever, it wasn't in a way that raised serious concerns from the general public, because they were leaving out the evidence, the accusations of serious sexual crimes they had heard while working on it. Into the mid-2000s, Epstein starts building up a new side of his persona, something he could really be known for, and that's being a patron of science. It gives dimension, right? Like he's a mysterious businessman who donates all of his money to science, and that kind of makes me poke less holes in who he is.
People sometimes wonder, like we're scientists, hanging out with him to get with these young women or something. There are some scientists like that. They were spending time with him because he was giving their laboratories money that they didn't have to write grants for.
Why was he doing that, though?
He clearly understood social engineering. He understood that rich people they can get anything they want, except the one thing they can't easily control is their reputation, because that requires other people's perceptions, and just being rich doesn't make you necessarily respected.
He donated tens of millions of dollars, some to MIT, some to Harvard. He would host dinners with guests like Stephen Hawking, Martin Nowak, Steven Pinker, some of the most famous intellectuals in the Western world. He would brand himself as a science philanthropist interested in genetics, AI, physics. His donations to Harvard would exceed $9 million. Maybe he was trying to build a big support network. Maybe he was buying friends who would defend his character in the future. Maybe his intentions were even more bizarre than that. At many of his gatherings, he would talk about a desire to inseminate large amounts of women at one time at his ranch in New Mexico, with the aim of breeding a better human race. But whatever his real intentions were, his intellectual friends loved him. Or at least he knew how to control his reputation. Other people he knew.
Yes! My prospects
makes sense why it's been a secret.
Nice, mine too.
Because nobody knew when back then.
No Dougie,
well, nobody
While
don't know
famed
until
mathematician
now.
Martin Nowak would call Epstein a genius, Stephen Pinker would later tell a different story.
I found it irritating to talk to him, all the more so because the reason he was in the conversation was because he had given money to these various projects. He likes smooching with smart and intellectual people, but he couldn't really, or had very little interest in exploring actual issues. He would wisecrack, change subjects, or get bored after a few seconds. Daniel Dennett, philosopher and cognitive scientist, had a similar experience. He asked me manipulative questions as a conversational gambit. I remember he said, "Suppose I gave you $1 billion. What would you do with it?" He had no interest in my answer. It was just about showing off his wealth.
The chemist Stuart Pivar attended multiple of Epstein's summits on his island in the Caribbean and had this to say.
He couldn't concentrate on a subject for more than 2 minutes before having to change the subject, because he didn't know what anyone was talking about and would blurt out the dumbest things. In particular, he had an affinity for posing pseudo-deep questions like, "What is up?" or "What is down?" at the scientific summits he hosted on his island.
Pivar recalled that the act eventually wore thin.
After a couple of minutes, because he had no attention span whatsoever, he'd interrupt the conversation and say things like, "What has that got to do with pussy?"
And that was another big part of his persona. Epstein never married, but his romantic interests were still a focal point in his social life. Specifically, he liked young women. Lawrence Krauss, a longtime friend, would say that Epstein always has women ages 19 to 23 around him. Donald Trump would say in 2002 that Epstein likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. People who interviewed him in the early 2000s would note that it was regular for him to have one or multiple young models in their early 20s near him at all times.
When we say beautiful women, we're not talking about kids.
Summit gatherings.
We're talking about
at one
adults,
point, his friend Woody Allen brought him a birthday note that would include a joke about Epstein being a vampire with a harem of young female vampires that worked at his palace. For Epstein and his friends, his obsession with young women was an open joke. It was one that they went back to often on top of that. They weren't hiding it. It was one of their favorite go-to lines. But even when you take into account the fact that Epstein probably did get a lot of his money from a Ponzi scheme, and he was doing dirty business, insider trading, like everything in the book, right? It's also kind of typical. There are a lot of people who have done stuff that's way worse than him. We don't really care. I think we all understand that billionaire capitalists become billionaire capitalists by exploiting, abusing, taking advantage of the financial system. We expect that. It's not really considered a sin in today's society, at least not in the way that we expect someone to be punished for it. And we also expect celebrities to be creeps. I mean, we have Leonardo DiCaprio who throws his girlfriends in the trash when they turn 25. People joke about that more than anything else. Like, we don't expect there to be some serious consequence. Years later, Vicky Ward, who had originally brought Epstein's lifestyle into the spotlight, would write,
"If only it had all ended there. This was what it had been meant to be. A gossipy piece about a shadowy, kind of sinister, but essentially harmless man who preferred track pants to suits, but somehow lived very large and had wealthy, important friends, hung out with models, and shied away from the press. But it didn't."
Because behind the curtain of money and mystery he built up, Epstein wasn't just another con man. And once the mask did slip, it would reveal horrors on a level that no one was ready for. The real story of Jeffrey Epstein was just getting started. In 1990, Epstein bought a house in Palm Beach worth a little bit more than $10 million. For Epstein and guys like him, it wasn't a place to live, it was a status symbol, like buying a BMW. If you wanted to be perceived as rich and powerful and well-connected, it was almost a requirement to have a place in Palm Beach. And for 15 years, it was his second home for parties,
bought a house
networking,
everywhere
visiting
he
in the
went,
winter. But in
It's like everywhere he
2005,
traveled, he
his
bought a
life in
house.
Palm
What
Beach
you
would
need a
also
house
become
everywhere
the
you
center
travel?
of the unraveling of his life and reputation, or at least
Oh yeah, I'm
should have
going to
been.
travel to the Bahamas for 2
In
weeks.
March of that
Buying a
year, an
house.
anonymous woman contacts the Palm Beach Police Department and claims that her
That's
14-year-old
crazy.
stepdaughter had been paid to strip and massage Epstein. The story was that the girl, who attended a boarding school for troubled teens,
They
had
redacted
attracted
a lot of
unwanted
these-
attention
a
from
lot of
other
the
students
files,
when
though.
she showed up to school
You don't really
with
know who
$300 in her
it's
purse.
a
With
lot of
other
names
kids
that we
gossiping
wanna
about
see,
her
we
and making
probably
a
won't
scene,
see.
eventually the school
bro.
police officer and therapist interviewed her to ask exactly what was going on. Visibly distressed, she described that an older friend had taken her to visit a massive waterfront mansion, where she was led by a 25-year-old blonde woman to a bedroom with a massage table where a man named Jeff demanded she undress and massage him. He also sexually assaulted her during their encounter. When she was shown a photo of Epstein as part of a lineup, she identified him immediately. The local
That's
police
fucking
spent
wild.
over a year building a case on him, completely undercover. They interviewed more than a dozen victims. They found hidden cameras.
Tell me what y'all think about this story, man, because that's just right there. That got my like. These men are not sick from what they did or nothing. Just crazy.